Everybody, is everything working? Can everybody hear me? Yes, there we go. Right, glad everybody can hear me. Hello, good afternoon. I'm very happy to see the technology is working. It wasn't so successful in the trial last week. And just quickly before we start, where is everybody from? Are there other people like me in Moscow? Other people from around different parts of Russia or from other parts of the world? Russia, Moscow, Moscow. Ulyanovsk. I don't have a clue where that is. Vladivostok. Lipetsk, fantastic. Kursk. Nice, St. Petersburg. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to have a spread of people. And is everybody at work, or is this during scheduled work time, or are people taking time off to attend the webinar? Nice. Nice, Svetlana. Between my lessons, you're very brave, Anna. Day off, Elena, you're very committed. During work, nice. Time off as well. Before going to bed, Victoria. I hope I don't put you to sleep. Hello, Vera. A class has been cancelled, Marina. Good job. Day off, Lydia. Very nice. And also between lessons for you, Olga. Good stuff. I hope it's all worth that essential planning time that we all need between lessons, and everyone has coffee and tea and whatever they need in order to keep going. Hello, Alina from Ukraine. Wonderful. Hello, Tatiana. And Kiev, fantastic, wonderful. I'm yet to go to Ukraine. I'm hoping to at some point. Oh, lots of places, and I'm very ashamed to say it. They're not places I know as of yet. With the wonderful, Tatiana. That's great commitment. I haven't, Vera, not yet, but hopefully soon. Do you have is there a better time of year to visit, or is there a best time of year to visit? From Kazakhstan, that's very exotic. August, I'll try. From Moscow, a bit closer to home, fantastic. Hello, Lulia. And Natalia, hello. Hi, Evgenia, and hi, Tatiana. From Antalya. Well, I think that wins so far for the furthest destination. Almaty, how fantastic! I've always wanted to visit the steeps. Hello, Christina. And hello, Yelena, as well. Sevastopol, that's great. That's quite far away from Moscow, especially. Sochi, another place bathed in sunshine, I assume. Well, let's hope she doesn't fall asleep, Valeria. But I can't blame her if she does. Mohammed, hello. Mohammed, where are you joining us from? Russia, fantastic. Which part of Russia? Nizhny Novgorod, fantastic. Yet another place I haven't been to, but I have some friends from there. St. Petersburg, Evgenia, hello. And Oksana, hello as well. Hello Asmik, and hello from Kazakhstan as well. Lots of people suddenly joining us. Me, I'm from England on the south coast, a small town called Bournemouth. We're currently probably most famous for our football team, if anyone's interested in football. But before that, we were probably most famous for beaches and language schools. And another person from Kazakhstan joining us from Nur-Sultan. How fantastic. You support Liverpool. Well, that's okay. I hear that they're doing quite well at the moment. I'm a huge football fan tomorrow, despite being from Bournemouth. A fantastic 20 years. It's really impressive that people have been teaching for so long. Ramsgate, I've never been that far north, and I've had a few experiences of New Zealanders, yes. I used to work with a New Zealander, actually. When I worked in China, my first teaching job. I've been teaching since 2008, so almost 11 years now. This is my 12th year of teaching. Is everybody ready to get started? Right. So, first of all, welcome. Welcome to this overview of Cambridge Proficiency and Advanced. I'm Raul Farguell, as you can read. I'm an Assistant Director of Studies here at BKC-ih Moscow. I have a huge interest in exams. I presented at the International House BKC Teacher Training Conference, and I did especially, my talk was on writing for exams. And I have a huge interest as well in writing, which is why I combined them. I had a journal article published by Cambridge Research Notes on improving grammatical accuracy in writing through peer correction. So I'm really interested in this area and how it all fits together. I think already that's almost enough about me. So I'd like to know quickly about where you work and why do you need Cambridge Advanced and Proficiency? If you could use the chat box, that would be fantastic. Just from yourself, Anna. Well, that's quite a good reason. Russian Presidential Academy, nice. Before CELTA, degree, university, exams, nice. Challenge yourself, tutor, nice, okay. Career, CELTA, Delta, it's the way I did it. Higher position, okay. Great. Students, language course, being a translator, just to brush up on your knowledge is a great reason. Okay, great. So hopefully a lot of these reasons, you'll see these are why people take Cambridge Advanced and Proficiency. So let's have a look at some of the things we're going to look at. So I'm going to start by looking at an overview of Cambridge Advanced. As we do that, I'll tell you why or how to prepare and skills and tips that will be useful for you for different parts of the exam. Then we'll look at a little bit on proficiency and how it's different from advanced, but a lot of the skills will be quite similar despite the level obviously being higher. And then we'll talk about how you might choose to take the exam or the things that will be really necessary for you to be able to take the exam. So you might be familiar with this new infographic that Cambridge English have produced last year. You'll notice that advanced and proficiency are at the higher end of this scale. They're extremely robust exams, as you might expect, being at the top of the level. And lots of our students here at International House start lower down with movers and flyers, and by the time they've almost finished school, they're already ready to take first certificate, or first, as it's now called, and then move on later to advanced and proficiency. As we go through this, I'll take questions after we speak about each part, and hopefully we'll have enough time to do all of that. If not, we can save them till the end. But yes, just it's important to note that the level required for advanced and proficiency is they're really good tests of whether or not someone is at that level. So let's start. What is Cambridge Advanced? What kinds of things does it entail as an exam? Well, it's, as I just said, it's proof that you have a certified level. If you pass advanced, no one's going to quibble about your level, and the same with proficiency. If you pass advanced, it shows that you're able to follow an academic course at university. You can communicate effectively. You can probably run meetings and definitely participate in academic seminars. You'll be able to express yourself with a high degree of fluency and also accuracy. It's accepted at universities worldwide, and more importantly, it doesn't have an expiry date. But who's it for? I asked you before to tell us why you wanted to take advanced or proficiency. And a lot of you said a lot of the things that I've written down. So it's for people who are just doing it for themselves, for people who want to have proof that they have a certain level in English. It's for current and future teachers, obviously. It's for other career options, people who are just doing it for themselves to develop their own career outside of teaching. It's also for students who want to be able to have a different kind of class. So they find general English isn't rigid enough, isn't structured enough. Well, the advantage is exam classes are very, very focused. So let's move on now to talk about the exam. Anyone familiar with the exam will know that there's 4 papers. The first paper is reading and use of English. It takes about an hour and a half. All students have an hour and a half to complete it. And they have 8 parts, 4 reading and 4 use of English, or 4 use of English. They come first, and then the 4 reading parts. There's 56 questions, but not 56 marks as we go through, I'll tell you, but there are some parts of the paper which have 2 marks per correct answer, and others which have 1. And this is what the handbook says. The handbook says that what's tested in reading and use of English is that you're able to deal confidently with different types of texts, etc., etc., etc. It tests your English with different types of exercises that show that you can control your grammar and vocabulary. So control is vitally, vitally important. And I think that's something that's often overlooked, but it can't be stressed enough. It's just not about what you know, but it's about how you use it. Now we're going to talk through different parts of the exam. So here's part 1. It's called multiple choice close. Candidates get a text like this, and they have to choose 4 options. Which word, or from 4 options, which word best fits the gap, which is most appropriate. What it really looks at is a deeper knowledge of collocation, how a word behaves, and by that I mean verb patterns, prepositions, and connotation from the context. So to give you an example, I'd like you to have a go at this one. I hope the slides are big enough for you to read. Can everyone have a go at this? Which word or which words best fit the gaps from A to D in each case? I'll give you the answers in 1 minute. Let's see how quickly you can do it. So win is right for number 1. How about 2 to 6? "30 seconds to finish that, please." Okay, so I'm happy to go through the answers. One is B, win, like was said before. 2 is C. 2 is C, which is insight. Then it's contrary, so 3C. 4A, care. 5B, disputes. And then number 6 is misled, B. Okay, and the reason for that is usually simply collocation, or most commonly the preposition that follows, and that's something that candidates often slip up on. So a lot of these words mean very similar things, but it's only the context and the grammar that surrounds it which students have to draw there, or have to be shown to look for. And similarly, part 2, open close, is kind of has the same idea, but the key difference is candidates don't get any options here. They don't get any help. So there is a kind of focus on collocation, grammar patterns, but it focuses a lot more on on textual cohesion, how a text is put together. And students often have to pay more attention to the evolution of the text and decides what best fits the gap. So once again, I'll give you 1 minute, or maybe a minute and a half, because it's slightly more challenging. What are the answers for 9, 10, and 11? So 30 seconds, please. Yes, I will do that now, Natalia. Okay, so lots of people coming in with answers. Let's look at number 9. Number 9 is because, and lots of people have written because. And here, looking at the preposition, the other side of the gap is really important. Paying attention to how because works as a word. So because of the manner in which our brains had begun to develop. Number 10 is such, and other people have written that. And of course here, knowledge of the chunk in such a way. So it's not just about individual words, it's a knowledge of individual phrases. We'll look at how to record those a bit later. And then, as lots of people say, in other words, again, knowledge of the way of starting a sentence in other words. So candidates really have to have a large knowledge of what we might call chunks, or what we might call mini phrases at this level, to be able to complete the exam. And again, the knowledge of words is the same thing that's tested at part 3, but in a different way. And it's something that candidates aren't always prepared for. So here, the word knowledge that students need focuses on the use of prefixes and suffixes. Prefixes change the meaning of words for those who might not be aware. So for example, important to unimportant. And suffixes change the type of words. So important to importance, adjective to noun here. And candidates should be aware that especially at advanced level, there's always at least one word which is changed twice. Again, can you try to complete the task? Remember, there's always one word which is changed twice. So professional is the example that's given, but 17 to 21. Okay, lots of good answers coming in. So here, the real key is to identify what type of word goes into the gap, and then how you're able to change it. It's not always about collocation, sometimes it is, but here it's about knowledge of how a word works rather than how a word behaves. A bit later, I'll show you ways of recording that. But right now, come becomes overcome, fit becomes fitness, endure becomes endurance, benefit becomes beneficial, and able becomes inability. So that was the word you had to change twice. Moving on is probably the most difficult task on the use of English paper. Students have to make the second sentence mean the same as the first using the word in bold, and it can't be changed. You have to use a minimum of 3 words and a maximum of 6. Here again, the knowledge of phrases, but also how to paraphrase, is really important. Can anyone guess what the answers are? Just some good answers coming in again. So yet 25 is does not earn or make nearly as much or so much. Both of those are okay. So does not make nearly as much or doesn't earn nearly as much. So would also be okay instead of as. And secondly, being pulled down and replaced with. Being pulled down and replaced, exactly like Ekaterina has written there. Being pulled down and replaced, or being pulled down and being replaced, or being pulled down to be replaced. So any of those variants. This is the first task in the exam, which is worth 2 marks. So it's really important for students to be aware, or candidates to be aware, that this is a really important task, and the chance to really make lots of, or get good grades because of this task. If you get half the sentence right, you do get 1 mark, but it's important which part of the sentence you get correct. And Cambridge determined that for their examiners while they're marking the papers. Again, we'll look at how best to prepare for this after we've done the writing. So things that people can do in order to become aware of the kind of language they need when they're preparing for the exam, and how best to record it, and strategies like that. Moving on to the first reading part of the exam. This one will look familiar to a lot of people. It's a typical multiple choice exam, and candidates must be able to locate the answer of the text, understand what the writer is saying, and then select the correct answer. So for this, skimming and scanning skills are vital for saving time, but also being able to infer meaning by using the title. So introduction to a book about history of color, students should already be predicting what the text is going to be about as soon as they read the title. It's a particularly useful skill for candidates with life experience, and it's a particularly important skill to develop in younger students who lack the experience of things, but raising their awareness of what happens in the world promotes higher thinking skills, which is particularly important. I don't expect you to read this and find the answer, but again, being able to highlight the important word in the question and then being able to find it. What's the key word in the question? What key word would you point out to people who want to take the exam? Color. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are coming up with the answer that I've got. I would probably pick problem over color. Can anyone think why I might pick problem over color, especially if I was giving advice to people on how to answer this question? Exactly, Svetlana. Everything is about color. So the whole text is about color. So the problem would be you'd find color lots of times, but the word problem, when you're looking in the text, you're looking for synonyms or phrases which mean the same thing. Here, it's much easier to find. And I've noticed that someone has got the right answer. The answer is C, because color is first and foremost a social phenomenon. Okay, very good, Alessa. So let's move on then to part 6. This is, I haven't got the text for this because this is the most time-consuming task and often the one that students find much more difficult than any other. As you can see from the questions, if you quickly read them, I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. So I haven't asked the question yet. I just wanted you to read the questions. The point of this task, or the reason why it's so difficult, is because if you look, for example, 38 is easier to explain it. Which reviewer shares reviewers A's opinions whether architects should take note of de Botton's ideas? There are 4 texts. Candidates first have to locate the original opinion and then find similar opinions or similar topics or themes that are discussed in the other 3 texts, and then decide which option is closer to the question. So the difficult thing is you first have to find, for example, what A says in 38 about whether architects should or shouldn't take note of de Botton's ideas. Then read, for example, B, C, and D, and find out whether they, or what they say about whether or not architects should take note of de Botton's ideas, and then decide which one is closest to A or which one shares A's opinion. It's a really difficult task. I've only found one way that works for preparing for this, and it's quite fortunately, there are 4 questions. So students should have 4 different colors. For example, in the case of 38, you take a red pen and you highlight what A says about whether architects should take note of de Botton's ideas. Then reading the other text, you highlight in the same color, and then it's easier then to compare back to what the original says, and you can make a better judgment. Again, then you might do 37 in blue, 39 in green, and number 40 in black. And therefore it's easier not to get distracted. In the exam, you don't have the luxury of 4 colors, so maybe over time it's worth developing different ways of shading. So you might circle an answer, underline an answer, a squiggly line, or put a line between sentences or something like that. But in order to train students, I found that 4 colors works best of all. But this task is by far the most time consuming. So I'd bear that in mind if I were you. Now moving on then to part 7. Is it possible to shade on computer basics? I don't have that answer, but possibly someone does. For part 7, this is a really great task for testing the lexical cohesion knowledge or cohesive knowledge of students. So the gap texts removes 6 parts of the same text, and students have 7 options to choose from when putting the paragraphs or sentences back into the text. What they have to do is look for 2 types of things. One is what we might call grammatical cohesion, and the other one is lexical cohesion, but there's an overlap between the 2. Things like pronouns, he, she, it, always used for referencing. Plural as well, that and this and these and those are also really important. Also, you might find that as the text evolves, that certain lexis are repeated in one part of the text and not in another part of the text. So that's something to pay attention to. Often, if the text is about dates, you might find that there's an evolution as well in dates. Yes, I mean, it's important to, again, just to stress that the idea about the different colors is there to train you to do this. You might find that later on using different underlining codes with the same pen works just as well, but especially at start it's such a difficult task that finding another way to do it and then transitioning is the best way. But again, back to part 7. It really tests, again, things like synonyms and antonyms and students' ability to be able to see how a text goes together. And you could do this simply by taking any text and getting students again to notice when things are repeated. This is also a good task for writing, because students often, or candidates often, don't use pronouns other than it. So you might get to use that and these and synonyms in order to make a text more cohesive. Giving students positive evidence of how this is done with, or how native speakers do it, with just one page in a book, for example, I find really helps. So start raising the awareness of how this is done, first of all. Yet reading is often the best way to train for this kind of task. Now we move on to the final part of the reading and use of English part. This is multiple matching. It's much easier than its cross-text multiple matching cousin. And here there's 10 questions, and you get 4 texts, maybe 5 sometimes, but usually it's 4 texts, and you've just got to find where the opinion, or which text, A, B, C, or D, maybe E, expresses this opinion. So it's worth remembering that this is worth 10 marks, 1 mark each. The other parts from 5 to 7 are worth 2 marks each. And of course it tests things like synonyms, different phrases for expressing the same idea. The Advanced and the Proficiency are really vocabulary heavy throughout. We'll look in a minute about the writing, and then we'll look at the listening and the speaking. And to varying degrees, they all expect a very wide lexical range, and they're very good at testing candidates on whether they've learnt the relative, or the relatively high level of lexis that are needed in order to pass the exam. The most difficult thing about this task is students often have to read quite quickly because it's worth 10 marks. So more or less 10 minutes per task in the exam is kind of the benchmark. That's often quite a bit less with the use of English tasks and a bit more with the reading tasks. But in this, to find an answer a minute requires students to be able to read quite quickly. And so students or candidates shouldn't feel pressured into following the order of the task. If they think part 8 is a good thing to start with, then they should start with that. If they think another part is a good opportunity to get lots of marks quickly, or vice versa, if they want to get a part over and done with, there's no reason why you shouldn't do part 8, then part 6, part 4, part 1, part 3, and part 5 in that order at all. So we'll start. We've got our first. Are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions to start with about what I've just said about the reading and use of English paper? All clear, okay. Textbooks, I will give you some advice at the end on textbooks. There is a slide with textbooks, so don't worry about that. We will look at CPE in a minute. I'm going to look, Olga, at how to record chunks of language later. I mean, the best way is there's a wonderful task which I do when I mark out different collocations, but collocations which not only have verb and noun, but also with a preposition. And so to draw students' attention or candidates' attention to that, a chunk is often larger, and especially with things like verb patterns. So I'll read a text, I'll pause, and students have to guess the next word. Often the mistake is people become obsessed with 2-word chunks, whereas some chunks, like take something into account, is actually 4 words. So becoming aware that language can even be fixed around 4 or 5-word phrases, drawing your attention to that is really, really important. Is it better to stand by reading the question, to start by reading the questions or the text? I personally prefer reading the questions first and then read the text. But some students prefer to read the text first and then read the questions, but I prefer to know what I'm looking for. And yes, the D in CPD's development. Have you ever seen interchangeable text in part 7? I'm not sure I understand the question with interchangeable texts. I'm going to move on now to talk about the writing. Again, it's an hour and a half. There are 2 parts, one where an essay is compulsory, and in part 2 where there's a choice. You get 3 questions and students or candidates have to prepare one, or have to write one piece. And it can be anything from a letter or an email, which can be formal or informal, a proposal, a review, or a report. All the writing has to be between 220 and 260 words. Students get hung up on the word count. It's not that important, especially if an answer is well developed. The word count is neither here nor there. An important thing to remember is that all the writing at Advanced is marked using the same criteria. It's worth noting that including everything they want in an answer really does make a difference to your mark, as we'll see in a minute. It's really worth pointing out to students that for all the wonderful grammar and vocabulary that you can put into an answer, it's only one of the 4 criteria that Cambridge use to mark. So we're going to look now at some more of these in depth. But look here, everything is marked from 0 to 5. So making sure students or candidates are aware of how their writing is marked will make them better writers, because then they're writing for a purpose. Students tend to finish a piece of writing and hand it in without really thinking who's reading it and why they're writing it. So introducing students to the marking scheme, I've often found, is quite beneficial. But that's not to say it's quite straightforward. This is the Band 5 descriptor for communicative achievement, because it's often misunderstood. I mean, no one really knows, or not a lot of people know what that means. So it's really important to break it down. So when we look at what does it mean by conventions of a communicative task, well, if we look at the idea of conventions, it quickly becomes obvious, especially if you look in the handbook, that it's really about register. Does an essay look like an essay? Does a report sound like a report? Does a review sound like a review? Is this informal email to my friend? Does it sound like an informal email that somebody would write to a friend? Now here's 4 sentences from an essay, report, review, and email. Can you tell me, are these appropriate sentences for the genre of writing that the students have done? What do you think? The essay sentence, is it okay? Why not, Natalia? Yes, so the first thing Olga's noted and Natalia's right as well. The word cool is just not right. And also the contractions. It's widely believed it's no contractions in an essay. It's not that an essay has to be formal, actually. An essay has to be semi-formal, and we don't use contractions. And the word cool is completely out of place here. How about the report? So Ekaterina says the report is okay. Svetlana as well. The report's okay. Okay, so the report is good. The report is fine. It's typically found in the opening line. The purpose of this report, okay. The review, Natalia says that's okay. How about the review? Kirill says it's okay. Pavel says it's okay. Probably too formal. A report and a review are quite formal. Yeah, the review is also fine. Collocation, I highly recommend. Strongly recommend would also be okay. And how about the email? Last but not least, the email. Too formal, Adiv says, and Yelena as well. Yeah. Okay, right, yes. Good, okay, everyone's one. It's terrible, isn't it? It's completely the wrong situation to use inversion. Or using inversion in this way, it's far too formal. It's not to say you can't use inversion in an email, of course not. But it's just far too formal. And in my humble opinion, never before have I had such a thrill. It just sounds completely wrong. Is the form and style of the essay given here the same as the Russian state exam? I'm not entirely up on the Russian state exam. I know that advanced would be the wrong level for the YEGE and OGE. And I know it has a slightly different criteria, that they're much more strict on which language should be in the essay, for example. But yes. And if we move on then to talk about straightforward and complex ideas, here we see the evolution of the same idea. And the important thing to highlight, what's wrong with the email, Tatiana, if we have a look, is that it's too formal. The use of inversion here is okay, you can use inversion, but the vocabulary used is far too formal, especially if it's an email to a friend, which, if you're talking about a bicycle ride, it would be. Excuse me. So back to straightforward and complex ideas. Here, look at the development of an idea. The fashion industry is not very good for most of the people that work in it. That's a fail. Or you're going to get band 1, maybe. Okay? Then, look at the next sentence. The fashion industry keeps wages low for millions of people in order to make a minority of people very wealthy. Better. Better. And then we see the last sentence. The fashion industry values a minority of people to the detriment of the majority. So here, what's really important in straightforward and complex ideas, i.e. achieving complex ideas, is the use of vocabulary in a precise way to be able to express ideas which are more difficult to express. And that's best contrasted with the last sentence and the first sentence. So vocabulary and grammar is often the lowest scoring part of the writing, and for very good reason. Students are not trained enough to be able to express complex ideas. So being able to use the vocabulary you learn in your class to be able to show that you have the ability to use them is more important than just teaching them. So that's often something that is overlooked. So being able to express yourself with high degrees of precision with the vocabulary you use is something that really sets high scorers apart from lower scoring candidates. And just now then to look at examples of an essay question. I have a question. Look at this text here. What's really important for students or candidates to include when writing? And the clue is at the bottom, underneath the two boxes. Two out of three ideas, that's good. That's the first thing. And not something that generally students struggle with. Anyone else have any ideas? Good, Ala. One is more important than the other. This is really important and something that candidates often don't do. Candidates often talk about two ideas, I pick two, and then in the conclusion they don't mention which one they think is more important. So therefore they're not answering the question. And if you're not answering the question, you won't score very highly at all on content. And if you're not answering the question as well, if you're not, for example, giving reasons, you're not going to meet the word count. But if you're giving reasons and you're developing your answer, the word count doesn't come into it. It's such an easy thing to be able to achieve. Likewise, I've had to separate it to make it fit on the slide here. Part 2, you have a choice. You have to pick one of these from the three. Again, paying attention to the requirements is really important. So in a report, the second paragraph is the one that students or candidates should spend a lot of time getting to grips with. Explain why you feel you've achieved what you've achieved in the job so far, describe any problems, and suggest further training. There's been no student should leave the exam without doing those three things if they pick a report. Similarly, if they're writing a letter, respond to news, look for the question, look for the things you have to reply to, and make sure you do that, as well as being able to use contractions, for example, in a letter, making sure that candidates are able to identify the content is a key pitfall, actually. Students often fall down on that, and it's often overlooked, and it's unnecessary marks lost. So again, just an overview quickly. Answer the question, pick one of the points that's most important, and follow the conventions of the task. Make sure if it's an essay, it sounds like an essay, etc. That there are sufficient number of paragraphs, and that the reader is always considered, who you're writing to and what context. For an essay, it's often your English teacher. For a report, it's often the principal of a school or the person who's in charge of a scheme. Make sure those things are kept in mind while writing. As I said, a fully developed answer completely takes the need to think about the word count. So an essay which has two ideas that are developed, expanded upon, you give an example or a consequence, or using a conditional to talk about a consequence or giving an example. The word count isn't an issue. A good range of vocabulary is okay, but practicing using it to be able to express ideas is much more important. So vocabulary shouldn't just make your writing difficult to understand. It should actually make it clearer for people to follow the intricacies of your argument. And you should practice how to use conditionals, inversion, relative clauses, participle clauses flexibly. So you don't end up writing the sentence like we saw in the email, but you're able to use it according to the different registers that are needed for the exam. Really important part. And then preparing for the writing and reading use of English, you'll see that there's a huge overlap. I hope you can see this example of a vocabulary book. The whole exam requires a phenomenal level of vocabulary. And if students or candidates do not systematically write things down, nothing will stick. Students that don't write things down, in my experience, end up at the end of the year still being reminded of things we've seen 4 or 5 times. Students that do reading out of class are able to notice new chunks, new phrases, new form of words, have a system. So you might see on the right here, this student has color-coded different parts of their vocabulary book. They've highlighted what they wanted to remember in red. They've written example sentences. They've used translation at some points, actually, but not very often, only for very specific vocabulary. If I could give one piece of advice, it would be I would also organize a vocabulary book according to different topics, relationships, traveling, hobbies, those kinds of things. So for example, if you have a vocabulary set about vocabulary, I would include words like single and married and partner, but I'd include be single, be married, my partner, have a partner, also phrases like hit it off, get on well with someone, haven't seen somebody in ages, so incorporate the grammar you need into the phrases, take an instant dislike to somebody, and I'd organize it according to different topics. So now, another thing that's really important, and is something that my research has focused on when I've been doing it, is what to do with written feedback. And it's really hard to make it count, because students often get it, look at it, but what to do with the mistakes? Well, one way of dealing with your mistakes or learning from your mistakes is writing them down. The mistake, the correction, and why. It might be a kind of lexical mistake in the case of take something into consideration, forgetting the to. It might be a collocation mistake. Not every rule is particularly sensible or even absolutely necessary. Maybe the candidate here has got confused with the correct collocation. Set text I have never dealt with, Yulia, so I can't comment on that. I'm sorry. But again, students should really take or be trained, or candidates should be trained to deal with feedback and how to improve using the feedback that they are given. There's no reason why this couldn't be used for sentence transformation as well if students make a mistake with tense or with prepositions. Again, making sure that that information is written down somewhere is really, really important. The third paper in the exam is listening. It's 40 minutes long, more or less. There's no time constraint here because obviously you hear everything together. You hear each text twice. There's 4 parts. There's 30 marks. Each part is worth 1 mark. And you'll notice that the text types are very, very similar. So there's multiple choice, sentence completion, another multiple choice, and multiple matching. We'll look at each of those in turn now. So the listening really tests your ability to follow and understand a range of spoken materials, etc., etc., etc. However, the skills they test are different according to each part, and we'll look at that now. Part 1 looks like this. There are 3 extracts, and there are 2 questions for each extract. There are 6 total questions for this, and the others are all have 8 questions. Part 1 is different from part 2 to 4 because it's lexically very heavy. There's lots and lots of vocabulary in it. Students who do better at listening in part 1 are very familiar with idiomatic expressions, are much better at following signposting. So, for example, there's often a question, what do the 2 speakers agree on? And the first speaker will say, well, I really liked the theme park because I thought the price was cheap. I thought that they had found a really great way of making the queues smaller. The rides were really fun. But what I really liked most of all was, and students are able to follow the development. And then when the next speaker says, oh, I really agree with you, they're able to think back to what the speaker was saying. So that's really important, following the signposting of the argument. The difficulty that students have with part 2 is a bit different. Part 2, you listen to a talk given by somebody and they speak about a topic. Here it's a trip to South Africa. The difficult thing is the text is written using synonyms, so it's not literal, but the words you have to put in the gap are literal. So being able to hear the words that you have to put in a text, students find difficult. But most difficult, or statistically, Cambridge say that candidates get more questions wrong when the answer is in the middle of the text. Why? Because students don't read beyond the sentence. So if we looked here, as well as his research project, Joss planned to write something for a website while he was in South Africa, or while he was in Africa. That knowledge while he was in Africa might appear in the text before the answer. So students have to be aware that they're listening holistically, and it won't necessarily appear in the same order of the question in that way. That's really, really important, to read beyond the gap. Part 3 will look very familiar, multiple choice, but it goes beyond vocabulary, and it's often the most difficult part for students. I think candidates think it's easy because they're familiar with the format, but really key here is being able to infer meaning. This doesn't just tell you the answer, but you have to read between the lines almost and infer what's happening, or talk about identifying the attitude that the speaker has, or the feeling that the speaker has towards something. And that's a real struggle. How could you train for this? Does anyone have any ideas about how you might train to infer meaning? Intonation is one way. Paraphrasing, great. Paraphrasing is obviously the most common way, and intonation's a huge clue about how someone sounds. I think there's one more important way. Read more books is obviously good. Or listen to more speakers. One way might be the way in which the speaker constructs their answer. Yes, I agree with what you say about blah, 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 and then, so they might be conciliatory at first in order to soften their criticism. So being aware of how speakers might construct their answer is also a way, yes, they said they appreciated something, or I understand what you mean, and then they give their, so understanding how grammar works in order to soften your answer is often a way as well of kind of criticizing something without hurting someone's feelings too much. For part 4, multiple matching, this is the task that students find most difficult because you have to do 2 tasks at the same time. Although here it's speaker 1 to 5, 21 to 25, and then 21 to 30, it's best to answer 21 with 26, 22 with 27, and so on and so forth. You often have to identify here the feeling that someone had, how they felt as a result. The biggest difficulty as well with this is teachers and students often think this is a vocabulary task, that it's just about hearing the answer and I write down the answer. This is actually a really difficult gist task. Understanding the general idea, again, or attitude or feeling for someone from the context. Often the vocabulary they use is never very specific, but it generally guides the student towards the answer. So understanding how the feelings and the opinions relate to the experiences that the people are talking about is really, really important. So the skills needed are both global, when we're talking about gist and general understanding, and being able to listen for specific information. Reading skills are important when you're selecting the key words in the question. What does the question want from me? What am I looking for? Being able to identify that's really important. A candidate's knowledge in life is really useful. And of course, knowing that even if you don't hear the answer the first time, there's always a second time. We have one more paper left to talk about in the advanced. Again, this is the speaking. It's the shortest part of the exam. There's only 15 minutes. But students might only speak for 5 or 6 minutes in this exam. It can be with one other person or 2 other people, and there are 4 parts to the exam. The first part's a general interview. It looks very simple. Where are you from? What free time activity do you like? Have you celebrated anything recently? This is the part that students do worst at. Why? Because they think it's easy. And the questions are quite straightforward. They're questions you might be asked every day. The trick here is that here's a chance to say exactly that, Ekaterina. They use too simple vocabulary. The trick here is to say that I skip breakfast in the morning rather than I don't usually have breakfast. So being able to produce the higher level vocabulary even though the questions are really easy. And they are easy, and Aliona's right as well. The answers are usually too short. They don't have to be very long. 15 seconds is enough. But these are very basic questions to which you should be trained. I find here, starting and finishing my lesson just for 5 minutes, okay, why don't you right, here's a question. You've got 30 seconds. Speak for 30 seconds. B, speak 30 seconds. Using the grammar we've already done in that lesson. Or can you use this particular construction to speak about this? And so training students to get used to using all the amazing vocabulary and structures we use in class to be able to handle speaking part 1. If we have time at the end, I can try to give more tips for certain things. Moving on to part 2, it's a completely different challenge. You are asked to speak about 2 of the questions for 2 minutes. And the important word here is students have to compare the pictures. And then afterwards they will be asked to answer another question for 30 seconds. The biggest mistake candidates make here is talking about the photos and not describing them. So I say, oh, in the second photo I can see that there's somebody speaking at the front of the class and there's some students who are listening. In the third photo, that's not answering the question. Students have to answer 2 questions in 2 minutes, and the best advice you can give is compare, 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 compare. Aliona's right that speculating is useful. Modal verbs and adverbs of opinion are really useful in this task. So the question is, how can students benefit? Well, students can benefit from listening to the teacher in the second photo, whereas in the third photo, they can benefit from working together. By forcing students to always use certain phrases in their answer, you're forcing them to perform in a way that the task demands. And that's really, really important. On the one hand, on the other, whereas, while, it might appear that, however. So being able to use certain phrases which lend themselves to comparison are really important. The important thing as well is when they get the second question, the 30-second question, or even shorter, don't do that. Usually it's about your own opinion. So again, try to answer honestly. Think about which situation you're most comfortable with, or something like that. Part 3 is my personal favorite task. As the name suggests, it's collaborative. Candidates have to work together. There are 2 parts. The first part lasts 2 minutes, where they discuss the question in the middle and the different factors which are placed outside the question. Then after that, they have 1 minute to decide usually which one or which 2 factors have most effect or are most important. There are 2 things that are really important here. The first thing is interaction, which might be really obvious. If a student speaks for 1 minute about their opinion, they're going to fail. The second really important thing is what we call active listening, and it really highlights the first thing. Nodding and making and erring noise while your partner is talking shows that you're listening. The first thing a candidate should do with this task is respond to what their partner has said. I see what you mean. I couldn't agree with you more. Or I really don't think so. I really think that this is where we should be looking at this, or something. Reacting to what your partner says is what we do in a conversation. Okay? Developing the ability to listen, developing the ability to collaborate, work with someone. Students don't have to speak about every point as well. That's another important thing. Speaking about 4 out of the 5 is fine, as long as it's a developed conversation which evolves as the time goes on. A partner can interrupt if someone is speaking too much. I think examiners are quite well trained in knowing that somebody's hogging all of the limelight and stuff, so students don't have to worry about that. For the second part, 1 minute's quite long. You might already know where your partner stands if you're listening to them, so a really useful thing to do is say, well, I think from our discussion, I don't think starting a family or finding a job are the most important decisions here. Don't you agree? And then, okay. And then you can say, okay, what do you think about getting married, moving to another country, choosing a university, or something like that? But find a way of first narrowing the options down, and then making sure that you're able to agree or disagree by the end of the minute is really, really important. Part 4 is related to part 3 in the sense that it's of the same topic, but it's much more difficult and much more abstract. And I think that students here really have to learn how to hedge. It could be because of this. I might think that if this, I'm not so sure, I've never thought about that before. Using fillers to give thinking time. You don't have to give an opinion. You can say, I'm not so sure, I might think it's this, it could be this. That's a difficult question. Being able to show you've got the linguistic resources to deal with difficult questions here is much more important than the answer itself. So being able to express degrees of certainty are really, really important. That's the end of our discussion about advanced. I now have a bit of time to talk about proficiency, but they're largely the same. There are certain, obviously the level is higher. They want almost double the level of vocabulary from you, and it's really difficult on that sense. But the reading and use of English is almost exactly the same, except there's no cross-text multiple matching, which is quite good. The writing, however, is much more difficult. This is part 1 writing. It's an essay, the same as in advanced, but look, summarize and evaluate key points from both texts. You've got 2 texts, about 100 words. Students have to be able to read very carefully, identify similarities and differences, all the commonalities, and write a discursive essay about them. Students must be able to paraphrase key points, show off a wide lexical range, but also all the grammar, the passives, the cleft sentences, the inversions, but also their own experiences to be able to come to a conclusion about the merits of each text and also the pitfalls of each text. Language for evaluating each text is really important here. The first text suggests, the second text puts forward the idea that. So it's a real level up from advanced. And being able to train it takes some work because it involves many different stages to go through. Is it possible to write it without any phrases? The important thing about these phrases is that it's called signposting. Good academic writing has signposting. It tells the reader what you're going to do. This is why I suggest using phrases. Is it possible to write it? Perhaps, but it's difficult to see how you'd maybe retain the same level of accuracy without these phrases. Also, speaking part 1 is the same as the advanced. Again, it's the opportunity to express themselves. However, students only have 1 minute in this case, so you've got to be a quick starter. There's no time for you. There's no time for you to and ah. You've got to really be prepared as soon as you sit down to start talking. Part 2 speaking is very, very different and quite difficult. Here you have 4 photos. There are 2 parts to speaking part 2. The first part, all of this part, is collaborative. Candidates have to talk about 2 of the pictures and how they relate to each other, or 3 of the pictures. So the examiner might say, look at pictures B and C and talk about the different types of people the workers might meet in these situations. That's it. And you say, I think they might do this. What about this? What about this? What do you think? Then the candidates will be asked 2 different questions that they have to discuss together, and it will probably involve all the pictures. So they might be asked to highlight some of the difficulties that all workers have in the food industry, and decide on which picture shows these difficulties and why. And then after 4 minutes, everything is over. It's a very quick task. So again, students already have to be able to speak about something as soon as they sit down, but have to also be very good at summarizing what they think in order to be able to make a decision about, for example, which photo best fits, etc., etc., etc. Part 3 is the most difficult, and it's also the longest task. Look, it takes 10 minutes. Students will typically get a card like this in task 1A, and they speak freely for 2 minutes about it. Then afterwards, their partner will be asked to comment on something, and the examiner will ask a question, and then the roles are reversed. Again, getting students to be able to structure their answer is really, 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 really important. They need to be able to justify why they think something. They must be familiar or comfortable with disagreeing with somebody, but doing it in a rather sophisticated way. So not just, no, I don't agree, but don't you think that blah, blah, blah is actually really beneficial for, is a much more sophisticated way of disagreeing with somebody. And students must be able to, again, contend with disagreement and explain why they think they are correct or right in this thing, or be able to talk about common misconceptions of their own opinion, all these higher level skills that even native speakers find quite difficult. Once you've done all of this, Cambridge sends you certificates and breakdowns of your grades. As you can see, the example on the right of Alfonso Peñas Alcántara. Grade C at advanced, and then the overall score and the different breakdown of their grades. Cambridge works it all out using something that's unique to Cambridge. There are 3 levels of pass, A, B, and C, and then even if, for example, you're not quite up to C1 level, you still get a proof of your level. It's a B2 level certificate. It's not to be sniffed at. I think this is quite important. Now, I promised to go over books and other resources. I'm going to do that now. So there are lots of books on the market. Here are 2 examples of objective and compact. Compact, as the name suggests, is especially good for a shorter course, for students that already feel very confident, are usually at the level already, and just need exam task training. So I'm using this with one of my students. Objective is specifically good for students who are already at a very solid B2 level, and are ready to make that journey, as I say, to C1, to be able to really prepare for the advanced over, for example, 9 months, for example, whereas compact is for the shorter course, and students who need more exam type training but already have a lot of the language that they need and just need it to be refreshed or practiced. There are some very good websites. The Cambridge English Assessment website I've used a lot, even in preparation for this, to get information about the task types, so students are very aware of what's expected of them, what Cambridge expect of them, and there's even teaching tips on there as well. Exam English has lots of practice exams. I can't remember the number, but it's a huge amount. It's more than any student will be able to do if they did something every day. It's a pretty impressive resource. English Revealed is quite the same. There's lots and lots of different tasks and material, and Ing Exams is also quite a useful resource to use in conjunction with others. There are others I could have mentioned. Flojo, for example, is really common, and lots of people know about that. There's, for teachers, there's Tim's free English lessons, which is really a treasure trove of tips and advice, and there's podcasts and all sorts of different things. Particularly useful if you're Moscow based is our own exam preparation courses. If you go to the website that's at the top and find the exam, we have short courses and long courses. And we're always starting new ones. For example, there's a huge demand right now, particularly in Moscow, and I assume in Russia, to be able to show the qualifications that, or to show employers, and yes, we do, Kirill, we do have CP, we do have proficiency courses, to be able to show employers that, look at my level, this is what I achieved. Not just that, we have other types of teaching courses, so linked to Advanced and Proficiency might be TKT, for example, CELTA, Delta, Business English, Advanced Methodology, Teaching One-to-One, Young Learners, those types of things. We now have time for some questions. I know I've rattled through the last few slides in order to host questions. So if anyone has any questions, I'm here to answer. What's the best order to deal with CPE reading? Andre, I don't think there's a best way. Yeah, as I said before, I think if you want to start with the ones that you find easiest so you gain confidence, I think that's a great way of doing it. That would be my way, probably. If you want to dedicate more time to the ones that carry most marks, I think that's quite a sensible one as well. For most time consuming, I think I would be very careful, because you don't want to get too bogged down and kidding yourself into thinking that you've got more time than you really have. I think extra help with writing is a wonderful, wonderful idea, Daria. If you could sort that out, that would be great. This webinar has been recorded. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Yelena, for joining us. Thank you, Nadezhda, as well. Thank you, Anna. And thank you for listening so attentively, and I know I've rattled a lot of information off to you, so thank you for that. Thank you, everybody. And if there's no questions, have a very, very nice rest of the day. Thank you.